Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pixel, and today on the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, I thought that it would be a good idea to take a quick look into the performance difference between a system that's running with completely default settings, and the same system running with a quote-unquote proper configuration. Now, why do this now? Well, put simply, I recently decided that I wanted to make the jump over to Windows 11, and since that means doing a full format anyway, I thought that now would be the least intrusive time to try and do something like this. Now, whilst the premise of this video is really relatively simple, I still want to make sure that I'm extremely clear about what I'm trying to demonstrate. This is not an overclocking video. I'm not trying to maximize the performance of any given game or benchmark, I'm simply trying to show you in a fair and balanced way how much your performance can vary depending on your configuration. In future, I may go back and retest every single aspect of the configuration separately, but for now, I just want to focus on the overall impact of not properly maintaining a decent setup. The system that we're going to be using today consists of the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X CPU, a GB X570 Aorus Master motherboard, our Sapphire Nitro Plus RX 6800 XT graphics card, 64GB of 3600MHz memory, and multiple M.2 NVMe SSDs, alongside a fresh install of Windows 11. For our default configuration, I quite literally told my motherboard to load its optimized defaults, and the last time that I upgraded the BIOS was around 18 months ago. Once Windows 11 was installed, I allowed it to automatically grab any updates and relevant drivers before finally downloading and testing a bunch of games that included an in-game benchmark. In short, this system was running with XMP and Smart Access memory disabled, our GPU was running completely stock, and some of our drivers were more than likely a little outdated. It's also worth pointing out that all the fan curves were set to default, and so the system sounded like a jet trying to take off whenever the CPU tried to do pretty much anything. But anyway, I digress. Alongside the in-game benchmarks, I also ran 3D Mark's Firestrike Extreme and Time Spy Extreme benchmarks, and this is where I came across my first surprise. The results for Time Spy and Firestrike were extremely close to the averages, meaning that, despite the self-imposed limitations, our default system was still performing better than nearly half of all systems running similar hardware. This seems to demonstrate that there's a lot of people out there that simply aren't getting the most out of their gaming setups. After all the benchmarking was complete, I saved the results and went about better configuring our setup. In order to avoid any potential warming benefits, I once again completely formatted the system, except this time I made sure to update my motherboard's BIOS prior to reinstalling Windows. During this time, I also made sure to enable XMP and Smart Access memory. Once in Windows, I manually downloaded and installed the latest drivers for both my motherboard and graphics card, and in my graphics card driver, I applied a modest overclock. I also made sure to enable Windows High Performance Power Plan and disabled any unused overlays such as Xbox Game Bar. Finally, I went about re-downloading all the games / benchmarks and I got right back to testing. Based on the results of 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme, I assumed that we were going to be looking at somewhere around an 8% uplift in performance, since the difference between our default and properly configured runs was 8.3%. However, upon seeing a lowly 2.5% uplift in Time Spy Extreme, I won't deny I was somewhat concerned that the other results might end up falling extremely close to what could be considered run-to-run variance. Thankfully though, that never ended up being a problem because when it comes to actual games, the performance uplift was even more pronounced than what I was hoping for, so before we go any further, let's take a quick look at the performance gains for each game tested. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we saw a 21% increase to average performance. However, there are points in the benchmark where the performance gains are actually closer to 40%, indicating that when multiple components are being stressed at the same time, we see the benefits of each of the individual optimizations. Assassin's Creed Valhalla sees a decent improvement of around 22%, and based on our prior testing, it's safe to assume that a good chunk of that uplift is provided by Smart Access memory, with the remainder coming from the GPU overclock. Surprisingly, Assassin's Creed Odyssey jumped even higher with a 28% increase to performance, though I'm assuming that this difference is mostly down to XMP offering a helping hand in the more CPU limited sections of the benchmark. Cyberpunk 2077 sees a 19% boost to its averages but a 33% boost to its minimums, meaning that the properly configured setup is going to be much less likely to experience noticeable stuttering. Deus Ex Mankind Divided saw much less of an increase than what I was expecting at just 11%, however, seeing that the majority of this uplift appears to be coming from the GPU overclock, it seems that there's a specific graphical effect that is causing major limitations here, hence why this is the oldest game tested as well as the worst performing. Far Cry 6 brings us right back to the realm of more impressive gains with a huge 27% increase to the average performance. Again, like we saw with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it appears to be due to multiple aspects of our configuration all working together. Unfortunately, Rainbow Six Extraction demonstrates the lowest overall uplift with just a 5% increase to FPS. Now, whilst I can't be certain as I've not had time to go back and specifically test this, there is a good chance that this is one of those games where smart access memory can result in slightly lower performance, as is the case with the game that this is built upon, Rainbow Six Siege. The fact that we still see an overall increase here is likely due to our GPU overclock. Not only does Horizon Zero Dawn see a decent jump of 25%, its minimums are also massively boosted. This is one of those occasions where the actual smoothness of gameplay is going to feel way more improved than the 25% boost to averages is likely to portray. The Division 2 on the other hand performed 13% better on our properly configured system. There's not really too much to say here since my best guess is the majority of that uplift is coming from the GPU overclock combined with slightly better lows due to enabling XMP. Borderlands 3 demonstrates yet another impressive uplift of 25%. Since we'd only expect the GPU overclock to increase performance by around 5 or 10%, it's likely that the majority of the uplift in this case is coming from both smart access memory and XMP. And finally, we have a game that I'm not entirely convinced is working properly here. Forza Horizon 5 is showing a rather unbelievable performance increase of 78% on our properly configured setup when compared to default. Okay, Future Pixel here. I just want to let you all know that I have gone back to retest Forza Horizon 5 and I can now confirm that these numbers are surprisingly entirely legitimate. It's right, yeah, a few little tweaks combined with the latest drivers does actually equate to nearly 80% increase in performance in this case. But anyway, back to the video. To put all this into perspective, simply by enabling XMP along with smart access memory, as well as making sure our drivers were up to date and applying a modest GPU overclock, so all in all, around 10 to 15 minutes of work, we were able to increase our average performance by a massive 25% across all the games tested. Even if we remove the two outliers being Rainbow Six Extraction's 5% and Forza Horizon 78%, that would still equate to an average performance gain of around 22%. Whilst, let's say for the sake of argument, a 22% performance increase is obviously very impressive, I still prefer to look at these kind of numbers in reverse and instead imagine losing 22% of my performance by simply not taking 10 to 15 minutes to properly configure our setup. 22% is quite literally the difference between hanging around the low 50s and staying above 60 FPS. Once again, I want to make it clear that I've made this video to demonstrate the importance of a proper configuration and not show the peak possible performance of any game or benchmark. I could have by all means pushed the GPU overclock even further, overclocked the CPU via either PBO or an all-core overclock, manually configured the memory subtimings, made dozens of tweaks within Windows, and tested each game with SMT both enabled and disabled to see which one performed better. But at the end of the day, I settled with simply enabling XMP and smart access memory, applied a very modest GPU overclock, and made sure all my firmware and drivers were up to date. In all fairness, I doubt that the majority of setups are going to be able to see performance uplifts as impressive as what we've seen here. This is mainly because not all setups are going to support either XMP or smart access memory, and not all GPUs are going to be quite so good for overclocking. However, that's not to say it's not worth going through and making sure everything is set up properly, because it most certainly is, even if you've already done so in the past. You see, most modern hardware has built-in safety features that basically fall back to defaults when something goes wrong. For instance, if our graphics card drivers were to crash, even if it wasn't due to the manual overclock, then there's a good chance the tuning tab would revert to defaults, with the only indication being a small notification pop-up that closes on its own. The same thing can happen if your computer hangs or even if there's a power cut. The motherboard may simply switch itself to a backup BIOS, which will most likely have a default configuration, or simply just revert to optimized defaults, removing any prior changes. So it's most certainly worth checking up every now and again to make sure that our system is still properly configured. Now, as you have likely noticed, I have mentioned XMP a fair number of times during this video. However, there is a good chance that it may be called something different in your BIOS, especially if you're running an AMD CPU. Now, on my system it is in fact called XMP, but it could also come under the heading of AMP, AXMP, DOCP, or maybe even EOCP. Whilst this can obviously be somewhat confusing, as far as I'm aware they pretty much all do the same thing, which is basically apply your memory's predefined overclock settings. When it comes to smart access memory / resizable bar, I simply recommend searching for guides related to your specific motherboard, as this can quite often require an updated BIOS and toggling of a couple of different settings that can be named and nested differently depending on your specific motherboard. Finally, when it comes to applying a modest overclock to your GPU like we did via the AMD drivers, your mileage will likely vary. It's really going to come down to your specific card's cooling setup and power management along with the silicone lottery. Put simply, some chips are going to perform better than others and there's not really much we can do about that. Thankfully, there's plenty of resources online that should be able to point you in the right direction. With all that said, this was just a quick video showing the potential benefits of a properly configured system. We saw a rather substantial uplift of around 20% for what really only equated to 10 to 15 minutes of research and application. If you've got any questions, suggestions or feedback, you can let me know in the comment section down below, and don't forget to slap that subscribe button so you'll be notified of our future uploads. For now though, from myself and everybody here at the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, we'll catch you later. Bye bye.